Mysterious God, we have lost our home. Help us to hear your call and find ourselves again in you. Amen. In wild places, I have heard the voice of God. From the time before human remembering, there existed an island called by the first people Limu. Every spring, fantastic cumulus clouds race over the orange and yellow flower-covered mountain slopes. The fast-moving streams, canyons, prairies, oak woodlands, cobbled beaches, tide pools, kelp forests, and white, foamy waters teemed with life. Thousands of birds nested on the cliffs among the waterfalls. But something was missing. And so Hutash, the name of the spirit of the earth, planted a new kind of seed. And from these, the ground put forth the first people, and the island was complete. Thus begins a story that's perhaps older than human writing, told by people known today as the Chumash. You may know this place, Santa Cruz Island. It is the largest island in California, and it lies in the archipelago across from Ventura and from Santa Barbara. The Rainbow Bridge story goes on. Hutash taught the people how to take care of themselves and how to take care of their island home. And for many years, they thrived and multiplied until Limu became too overcrowded. And then Kakanapma, the mystery behind the sun, conferred with Hutash, and they agreed that the people needed a bigger place. And so they gathered all the human beings on the top of the highest mountain and caused a rainbow to stretch over the sea to a broader land. Some of the people easily crossed over, but others became distracted and dizzied by the waters far below them. They fell from the Rainbow Bridge into the ocean waters, and they were transformed into dolphins. In wild places, I have heard the voice of God. Now, when dolphins join me and when I'm surfing at Ocean Beach, I can't tell you how much joy it evokes. There is almost nothing better than that in the world, because you feel kind of connection with the dolphins. There's something that's familiar about them and something that's just wildly, jubilantly different. But this story does not just concern the deep connection between dolphins and human beings. Some believe that it's actually a story about sea level changes that are part of the geologic record. At the end of the last ice age, when the sea level was about 400 feet lower, the 4 Channel Islands were all joined together. And as the seas rose, the populations of those 4 separate islands could not support so many people. And so people had to move to the mainland. Rosanna Xia tells this story in her book, California Against the Sea, because she hopes that we will see the massive rise in sea level as an opportunity for human beings to mend their relation with the ocean and with the earth. During the last 100 years, the sea has risen by about 9 inches. Before the end of our century, in the lifetime of the children who sit right here before us, the sea level will rise by 6 to 7 feet. Human beings have caused a catastrophic change in the composition of our atmosphere. Almost a third of the carbon dioxide released by human beings since the Industrial Revolution, and more than 90% of the resulting heat have been absorbed by our oceans. Carbon dioxide mixing with ocean water causes a chemical reaction that increases the acidity of the seas and makes life there far more complicated. The seas are absorbing the heat equivalent of 7 Hiroshima bombs detonating every second. We are the first generation to experience the effects of climate change, and we are the last generation who can make a substantially different course possible. We know this, but don't really comprehend it. It's so hard to continuously be conscious of such a danger and of such a grave responsibility. Now, in the face of this situation in our lives, Jesus gives us very good news. During the last weeks of Easter, our readings show us how to live in intimacy with God. And today's gospel comes from the last meal that Jesus shares with his friends before being killed. Imagine the tangible fear in that room as he prepares them for his departure from this world. It must have been like a last meal at San Quentin prison before a prisoner is executed. And so Thomas says to him, "How can we know the way?" And Jesus responds with the last of 7 I am statements that he uses throughout the Gospel of John. Earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life, the light of the world, the door, the good shepherd." And today, he tells them, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower." Jesus says, "Abide in me as I abide in you." And he uses the image of this vine to prepare his friends for his death. He says, "I am the vine, and you are the branches." He says, it's almost as if he's reassuring them, death will not separate us. I will not be leaving you. We will become even more intimately connected. Do not be afraid. And Jesus goes on, he says, you will see the evidence of our connection. Look at your life and the lives of those around you here. You see the richness of this fruit that they are bearing. Now, when Jesus says this, I do not read this as a threat. It's not as if he's saying, stay with me or you'll wither and die. Instead, it is a promise that we do not need to worry, that we are in this together. Jesus is saying our companionship will be even closer than we can imagine, that we walk side by side with Jesus at one point, and then soon Jesus will abide even more closely in us. Now, there are examples of this all through the Bible. It's an extraordinary thing. In the book of Genesis, God breathes breath into human beings. Like the breath sustains human life. And in the Galatians, Paul's letter to the Galatians, Paul writes, it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And in the book of Acts describes God as the one in whom we live and move and have our being. So one might say that this is the culmination of Jesus' teaching. It's about abiding in God. Our goal is not simply to follow Jesus or to get other people to follow Jesus or even to obey what he taught. Instead, we live in Jesus as Jesus lives in us. And this experience of intimacy is what life is all about. And it's at the heart of my faith, and it's at the heart of my understanding of the earth, too. In wild places, I have heard the voice of God. Now, as a student of religion, I've carefully studied the connection between the Spirit of God and the natural world. And many of us in this room have had an experience of transcendence in nature, a sense of the richness of the cosmos, a sense of our connection with all being. And these encounters, they show us that our picture of God is too small. When we begin to glimpse how interrelated life is, we cannot go back to pretending that one individual or one group or one nation or one species can thrive all on its own. Religion then stops being a form of tribalism, and it becomes an opening in our hearts to wonder, to gratitude, and to love. So let me talk about 2 people whose lives were especially changed in this way by meeting God in nature. The first is Ralph Waldo Emerson. When he was a young man, he was in charge of the Second Church of Boston. So it was a church that had been founded in 1650. So it's a church that had been founded 200 years before this church was founded in 1849. And when Emerson used to go visiting old Revolutionary War veterans, he would go and he just didn't even know what to say to them. He was so young, he worried about preaching a sermon every day, every week for the rest of his life. You can imagine how frightening that might be to a young person. And he also had very big philosophical questions about what happens when we celebrate communion. What happens to the bread and to the wine? Now then, a terrible tragedy struck. His wife, Ellen, who was only 20 years old at the time, died of tuberculosis. And Emerson was entirely lost. He completely lost who he was. He resigned his pastorate. He resigned his church. He sold all of their household furnishings. And on a terribly bitter, cold Christmas day, he departed across the gray expanse of the North Atlantic with the hope that he might go somewhere where he might find himself. In 1836, Emerson published what he discovered on this search in a book called Nature. Feeling confined and limited by tradition in the past, Emerson just stopped believing in them. He gave up faith in the promise that someone could teach us something that would be genuinely useful as we tried to understand who we were. And instead, he began to believe that we should go and experience God firsthand, ourselves, in nature. And that nature is a symbol of spirit. So this is what he writes. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. All mean egotism vanishes. The currents of universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. Later he writes, behind nature, throughout nature, spirit is present. The supreme being does not build up nature around us, but puts it forth through us, as the leaves of the tree put forth new branches and leaves through the pores of the old. Now, Emerson at that time was beginning to become friends with a young man named Henry David Thoreau, and he encouraged Thoreau to start writing a journal and to be a writer himself. And when Thoreau was looking for a place to build his cabin, Emerson said, hey, you can build your cabin on my woods on the shores of Walden Pond. And then, generations and generations later, in 1975, a 29-year-old woman who had just written her master's thesis on Henry David Thoreau won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature on a book that she wrote recording her own encounter with nature and spirit. Her name was Annie Dillard, and the book is her memoir of living by a creek in Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the book is called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Now, the difference between Annie Dillard and Ralph Waldo Emerson is that Annie Dillard saw all the terrifying things in nature. The vastness of the universe and the void is more clear to us today. And she saw the terrible ways that animals preyed on one another and the frighteningness of seeing like swarms of insects, and of an insect that in particular injects poison into its prey and then liquefies it and eats it. Quoting Pascal and Einstein, Annie Dillard wonders if our modern understanding of God has spread as our vision and understanding of the universe have spread to a fabric of spirit and sense so grand and subtle, so powerful in a new way that we can only blindly feel their hem. And in that theological and liturgical book, Annie Dillard regards the great beauty of this world as grace, as a gift from God. And at the end, this is what she writes. Do you think you will keep your life or anything else you love? But no. And yet you see the needs of your own spirit met whenever you have asked. You see the creatures die, and you know that you will one day die. And one day it occurs to you that you must not need life. I think The dying pray at the last, not please, but thank you, as a guest thanks his host at the door. Divinity is not playful. The universe was not made in jest, but in solemn, incomprehensible earnest, by a power that is unfathomably secret and holy and fleet. There is nothing to be done about it, but ignore it or see. The seas are rising. How can we know the way? God speaks to us through nature, often in ways that we do not expect, sometimes in ways that are not altogether comfortable for us. But we will not hear if we do not listen. Let us mend our relation to the earth and build a bridge to a more humane civilization. Jesus, the true vine, reminds us that at the core of every being is the power to love. We will never be truly isolated or alone. He will always abide in us. In wild places, I have heard the voice of God.